Hello, and welcome to this series of presentations from the Grade CERQual project group. In this second session, I'll be giving a brief introduction to qualitative evidence synthesis. I'm Claire Glenton from the Norwegian Institute of Public Health in Cochrane, Norway, and I'm presenting on behalf of the Grade CERQual project group. The learning objective of this session is to gain a broad understanding of the different stages of a qualitative evidence synthesis. Now, this will be a quick run through, but at the end of the session, I'll be pointing to some resources that you can use to learn more about how to do a qualitative evidence synthesis. I'll be going through the following stages of a qualitative evidence synthesis: formulating the question, developing inclusion criteria, searching for studies, including and sampling studies, critically appraising the studies, and extracting and synthesizing the study data. When it comes to the final stage, assessing confidence in the findings using Grade CERQual, we'll be coming back to that in the next sessions. So let's start with stage 1, formulating the question. Imagine this scenario. Your government is preparing a communication strategy for routine childhood vaccination. To help them design this strategy, they want to know what parents think of current communication strategies. What do parents say that they want and need from this type of communication? So what I'd like you to do is to try and formulate a question that covers this topic and that you can use as the main objective for your review. And you may want to use the SPICE structure below to help you. So think about what setting you're interested in. What type of population, whose perspective, what intervention or topic you're interested in. If there's a comparison, then include that. And finally, what is it you want to evaluate? For instance, do you want to evaluate people's views or attitudes or experiences? And stop the video for a few minutes while you're doing this. This is actually the topic of a Cochrane qualitative evidence synthesis. And in this synthesis, the authors formulated the objective as follows. The specific objectives of the review were to identify, appraise, and synthesize qualitative studies exploring parents and informal caregivers' views and experiences regarding communication about childhood vaccinations and the manner in which this information is communicated. If we were to put this into a SPICE structure, it would look something like this. The setting was global, even though this wasn't specifically mentioned in the objective. The population were parents and informal caregivers of children under 6 to reflect when routine childhood vaccinations are generally given. The topic of interest was communication about routine early childhood vaccination. There was no comparison, and what the review evaluated were people's views and experiences. In stage 2, you need to turn the review objective into more practical inclusion criteria. You should start by defining the main concepts in your objective. So typically the setting, the population, and any other concepts you want to focus on, such as an intervention if there is one. You also need to decide what type of qualitative studies to include. You may decide to include all types of qualitative studies, but you still need to define what you mean by that. In addition, you should decide if you want to set a cutoff date for when studies were published. For instance, you may be looking at a topic where older studies are less relevant. And you need to think about the study languages you will include. On the one hand, you need to make sure that you're including the most relevant languages for your particular topic. And you should have a good reason for excluding languages. At the same time, you need to think about how you'll translate studies in languages that you're not proficient in. Some qualitative evidence syntheses are done alongside reviews of intervention effectiveness that typically look at randomized trials. If that's the case for your synthesis, you may want to think about whether you only want to include so-called sibling studies. that is, qualitative studies done alongside those trials, or whether you want to include all qualitative studies, both sibling and non-sibling studies. In stage 3, you search for the studies. When searching for studies, you'll need to make decisions about a number of issues. This includes deciding which databases to search in, deciding whether you want to carry out citation searches or go through the reference lists of the studies you find, and deciding whether to search for unpublished studies or reports in the grey literature. Where you search and how much effort you put in will depend on the topic of your review and how well researched the topic is. In this particular review, the review authors searched in Medline, Embase, and CINAHL, as well as Anthropology Plus. They also searched the reference lists of the included studies. Stage 4 involves including and sometimes sampling studies. In a qualitative evidence synthesis, you're aiming for variation in concepts rather than finding and including every possible eligible study. This doesn't mean that you should not look for a lot of studies. A small number of studies and a lack of data can threaten your ability to make broad claims. But as you will be expected to familiarize and immerse yourself in the study data and the study context, a large number of studies can prevent you from carrying out a thorough analysis. So in syntheses where many studies meet the eligibility criteria, one approach is to purposely sample a selection of these studies. In this review, the authors identified a large amount of studies and chose to sample. And here they sample studies based on where they were from to ensure that they were included studies from both high, middle, and low-income countries. They also sample studies based on their relevance to the review topic and on their data richness. Once you've included your studies, your next step is to critically appraise them. When critically appraising or assessing the methodological limitations of the studies, which tool should you use? There are many tools out there for critically appraising qualitative research, but there is actually no consensus on which tool is best. And we do have a project called Camelot that's working on this. But in the meantime, we suggest that you select a tool that you're familiar with and that fits with the grade CERQual assessment. And we'll be talking more about this in the session later on assessing methodological limitations. But in this review, the authors chose to use an adapted version of the CASP tool. In stage 6, you extract and synthesize the study data. Now, when it comes to synthesizing studies of qualitative research, there are a lot of different names and approaches described in the literature. It may be helpful to distinguish between approaches that are more or less aggregative and descriptive and approaches that are more configurative and explanatory. In an aggregative approach, review authors take the data from the primary studies and add it up in a quite descriptive way. In a more configurative approach, review authors spend more time arranging the data, trying to identify patterns, connections, and explanations. So in a more descriptive or aggregative approach, the data does not go through as much transformation. The review authors mainly describe what was presented in the primary studies. In a more configurative approach, the data is more transformed, as the review authors go further in drawing the data together in patterns or theories. Most synthesis approaches, however, are neither completely aggregative or completely configurative, but somewhere on this spectrum. We can also distinguish between synthesis approaches that are primarily deductive or primarily inductive. In a deductive approach, review authors start with a theory or framework that they use to organize the study data. They can simply add their data to the framework, but this process is also a way of testing the framework and possibly adding to or improving the framework. In a more inductive approach, review authors start with the data and build a theory or framework using this data. In this review, the review authors chose a thematic synthesis approach, which is a more inductive approach. So they didn't start with a particular theory or framework, but used the study data to create themes and categories. So, once you have finished synthesizing the data and you have a set of findings, the next stage is to assess how much confidence you have in these findings using the grade circle approach. And this is the topic of the next few sessions. And I'd like to acknowledge the contributions of the rest of the Grade Circle project group, and also to Karen Hammers for the slides concept which we've used for describing aggregative and configurative approaches. For more guidance on conducting a qualitative evidence synthesis, we suggest you look at the resources developed by the Cochrane Qualitative and Implementations Methods Group. Cochrane Epoch has also developed a template for qualitative evidence synthesis, which is free online. To learn more about Grade Circle and for further reading, you can visit the Grade Circle website or join the mailing list or the project group. Thanks for listening.